Greetings everyone, this is Gaia Earth Goddess coming back with another video, and I just wanted to touch on something I've wanted to talk about for a while now. And the title of this video is going to be something to the effect of the slave ship narrative is a lie. And the reason why I say that is because recently, through another YouTuber named Dan Calloway, I started researching my family history and also researching the slave trade and the slave ship narratives that are out right now. And Dan Calloway is an YouTuber, and for the past, I'm gonna just round it off to 8 years. It might be more than that. He has been advocating for the quote-unquote black populations in the U.S. to stop and take a look at our history, because there has been an overwhelming effort by our government and other governments worldwide and in Africa to hide the truth that we are not of African descent and that we are the original American Indians of this land, and that we have always been here and that we were never slaves. So he is just debunking every historical thing that we have been taught about ourselves. And one of his sayings is, if you don't believe me, research it, because he has sources upon sources that he puts up on his channel to show, hey, they're lying to us. We are the original Indians. This is us here. So, he's like, if you don't believe me, research it yourself. So that's what I started doing. And, a few years ago, I started looking into my family history on my mother and father's side. I started on my father's side, and I found out that my father was almost full-blooded Washita Indian from Louisiana, mixed with a little bit of French. And my mother's side is almost full-blooded Muskogee Indian, mixed with a little bit of white. I'm not sure what type of white, but some white in there. Everybody got some white in there. So I found that out, and I remember talking to my mom. And one of the things Dan Calloway always says, he said, go to the elders in your family and ask them if they remember hearing any stories about slavery, slave ships, Africa, anything that goes along with that out of Africa slave ship narrative. Ask them and listen to what they say. Because we're getting the African slave ship story from the school system. But if you go to our elders in our family, they're not going to talk about Africa or slavery. They're going to talk about farming and other things like that. So I was like, cool, I'm going to do it. My mother just so happens to be the elder in her family. She's the oldest person in her family. She's the oldest woman, she's the oldest person. So going to the elder in my family on my mother's side was easy, because I just had to call her, go to her house. So I asked her, did anybody in our family ever mention being of African descent, like great-great-grandmother, great-great-great-grandmother, all of them, they ever mention being of African descent? She said no. I said, do they ever mention being a slave or any type of slave? She said no. This is the first time I ever heard her say this, like actually say that they didn't. She said that one of her relatives told her that it was during slavery time and they worked in the fields. I said, but did they actually say they were slaves? And she said no. I said, did anybody in our family ever mention being Indian? And just as quickly as she said that no, she said, yes, we're Creek. She went into telling me a story about how one of my uncles found out through the grapevine in the family by talking to some of the other elders before her that we were actually Creek Indian. I said, well, we're Creek. So I started looking into that. Lo and behold, after digging through some family history online, didn't take that long at all, found out that we are actually Creek Indian. So, and it's amazing, because it didn't take me that long to find out I was Creek. It didn't take me that long to find out I was Washita. It doesn't take that long to undo all of the mental training that you have been taught since you were little, the lies. So after that, I started looking into the slave ship narrative and how they pulled this off. And one of the things I started looking up was, how do we know what was going on in these slave ships? And according to science, according to historians, they're using like two accounts. from these two ex-slaves, can't remember their names right now, and they were on these slave ships, and they talked about what happened to them. And as they got to where they went, they grew up, learned to read and write, and wrote these memoirs, and that's what the historical record is basically leaning on, are these two men. But if you look at the memoirs, I looked at part of them online. When you look at the memoirs of these two supposed enslaved Africans on slave ships, the memoirs don't make a lot of sense. The average slave ship, let's just say the average slave ship had about 300 slaves. The average crew was about 100 people, from what I learned. And you have 300 slaves to 100 white people, Europeans, whatever you want to call them. Because they weren't all white either. A lot of people don't know that either. So you have 300 people to this 100 crew. And what the documents say are that when it was time to feed slaves, they would, get this, unchain the slaves, go down where the slaves were. They would send a few of the crew downstairs. Whole crew wouldn't go down. They would go to the bottom of this slave ship, send a few downstairs with the food in these large cauldrons, and they would unchain the slaves and then go around throughout the rows and nooks and crannies in between and feed them. And my thing is, like anybody else's first thought would be, if you have 300 people and you just unchain them, and there's less than 100 people downstairs, because the whole 100 is not downstairs. The other rest of the crew, let's just say they seen 20 downstairs to feed the slaves. The other 80 are still upstairs. So there's like 20, maybe 25 of the crew downstairs with 300 people that they are unchaining. Why are these slaves not fighting them? Why are they not killing them? Why are they not taking the cauldron and pouring the food out over their heads and bum rushing? It's only 25 downstairs in the bottom of the ship. So that was my first question. That didn't make sense to me. They were constantly, if you read the record of slave ships, they were constantly unchaining the slaves for stupid reasons. They would unchain the females, supposedly unchain the females, to bring them to the top of the slave ship to make them dance. In other instances, they would bring them to the top of the slave ship to make them cook. Because they had things like yams and rices and things that really had to be like cooked, and so they would make the women do it. But my thing is, if you're constantly unchaining these people through making them dance, cook, and feed and all that kind of stuff, why aren't these slaves bomb rushing this crew of 100, because it's 300 of them, and taking over the ship? Why aren't there? And there are stories, supposed stories of slaves revolting and taking over the ships, but it's not a lot of stories. Why wasn't this happening more? The slaves just so scared that they had guns, that they were just so scared they didn't bum rush these people and take over the ship while they were serving the food or making them dance and stuff like so. That was the first red flag in my mind, because that did not make sense. The second red flag was one of the things that I remember distinctly that I read on the slave ships. They would make this slop, but it would be made largely out of sweet potatoes or yams. Mind you, Europe does not grow large amounts of sweet potatoes and yams. From what I read, they would have to grow the sweet potatoes and yams and also corn in the Americas. Okay? These large quantities of sweet potatoes and yams would be shipped back across the Atlantic Ocean. Now, this is the story they're telling you in history class, if you look in depth. Back across the Atlantic to Europe, and they would put in these large vat things and put on slave ships. So you mean to tell me, now, if you look up the slave ship narrative, the slave ship narrative says that that the voyage took about 3 months. So you're talking about 3 months worth of yams and corn and other items. Water, because they can't drink the ocean water. So you're talking about fresh water. This is heavy stuff. You got 3 months worth of that. 300 people and 100 people on the ocean in this heavy ass boat made out of heavy ass wood. And they have to float for 3 months across the Atlantic with all this stuff without sinking. Do you know how heavy that ship had to be, if it existed, to have 300 people with yams and potatoes, yams and corn and all that? So, one, how do they get so much food? This is just one slave ship that needed thousands of pounds of yams, thousands of pounds of corn, thousands of pounds of water to feed 400 people for 3 months. Do you know the immense amount of food and water it would have took for 3 months for one ship? And they're saying they sent hundreds of these ships across the Atlantic. This doesn't make sense. Also, these thousands of pounds of yams and corn that were grown for these slave ships, where were they grown at? Why is there no evidence? And there is none, because I looked it up. There's no evidence of any farms or plantations in North, Central, or South America that existed that grew the yams, corn, and other items needed on slave ships to nourish the slaves and the crew. We have records of plantations, we have records of large farms, but we do not have any records of large farms existing to just specifically grow the yams and potatoes and corn. You have to realize this is thousands of pounds of food per ship. These slave ships would have needed their own orchards and farms specifically just for them to grow this immense amount of food. And if that truly existed, that would have been a record of that existing. Why are there no records of any of the farms that cooked any of the food that went on slave ships? Because you would have needed a massive crop system to pull this thing off just for one ship. And they're saying there were hundreds of ships. So why is there no evidence? Why is there no part of North America where the soil is just decimated because for 300 years they were growing millions of pounds of yams to go to the slave ships? Or you would see evidence to this day of some of the extent of growing that much food at the same time. That does not exist nowhere. That's the second red flag. Also, the ships themselves. Now, everyone's seen those little ships where the slaves are packed in like sardines and everybody's all squished together, and the ship is massive and it's wooden, and you're like, oh, okay. But then you have to realize, what trees are they cutting down to build these wooden ships? Because Europe, England, those places, they have trees, yes, but they don't have any big majestic trees you can just chop down and build. America does, but on the coastline where Georgia, Florida, New York, the eastern coastline, our trees are skinny. We don't have any big giant trees that are like sequoias and things like that you can like chop down and really build hundreds of massive Titanic size ships with. Think of the Titanic but made of wood. That's what they're saying the slave ships were like. What trees? You would have to go all the way, and when I read this is that the story is they were getting wood shipped in from the other coast, like California and things like that. We have those big sequoias, those big trees. They were supposedly logging there, taking the logs out of the west coast of the United States, coming to the east coast and shipping the wood off to the slave ship companies. There are other stories of them logging and getting the wood from other parts of Central and South America and doing the same thing. But my thing is, all these giant logs from these giant trees, who's transporting the giant logs? There are no cars. There are no trucks. So it's horse and buggy. So that's another red flag. If you're getting all of this wood from these trees to build these massive slave ships, then you have to have a fleet of thousands of horses to pull this stuff across America or across wherever you had to pull it to get to the port, to ship out the wood to the slave ship companies to make these slave ships. Why is there no record of that? Why are there no records of where the wood came from to build the ships? There would have been some kind of record, because you would need thousands upon thousands, probably millions of pounds of cut up wood to build these hundreds of ships that were the size of the Titanic but just made out of wood. So that's another red flag that this is a narrative and it's not actually true. They can't even show you the farms where they grew the food. They can't show you where they sourced the wood. There is no evidence. Whenever you cut down a lot of trees in one area for, I don't know, 300 years, you should be able to see to this day, hey, there's deforestation in this area because for 300 years they were constantly chopping down trees right here, millions of them, to get millions of pounds of logs to build ships. But you never see that. Where's the evidence of the horses bringing them across? There's no evidence of that. People are not researching this slave narrative because it is a narrative. It's a story. Also, back to what I was saying about them taking the slaves from the bottom of the slave ship and bringing them up to the top. They would bring the women up to the top and make them cook. And from what I read, they would take these large cauldrons. You know how they show the witches' cauldrons? Kind of like that, but they would be really, really huge cauldrons. And they would have the ingredients in there and have the women cooking, okay? Mind you, the ship is made out of wood. So, if you're on a wooden ship and you're starting a fire to cook something, how come the ship isn't burning up? What's under the you have you're burning wood or charcoal or something, but how come the ship didn't burn down? Because you're cooking every day for 300 people, and they were cooking 2 meals a day. Can you imagine cooking 2 meals a day for over 400 people, 2 meals a day? You'd be cooking all day. So they would have the women unchained all day and the women never attacked them. You see how it's not making sense? If you look up records, historical records of other ships during quote unquote slavery time, just any other ship, it was common knowledge to take the food and have dried food. They would have like jerkies, like dried meats, nuts, dried foods, because they would not cook on boats because they knew that the boats were made out of wood and they would burn. But for some reason on slave ships they made this exception and people were cooking on a wooden boat that never burned up. It doesn't make any sense. What was keeping the slave ships from burning up when you cooked on it? It's made out of wood. That's what I'm saying. It's a lot of things with the slave ship narrative that do not make sense. Like they supposedly brought Africans over here who knew nothing about this land. But as soon as the Africans got over here, they knew exactly what to do to pick the cotton. They knew exactly what to do to farm the indigo. They knew exactly what to do the rice. And you're like, wait a minute, how did they learn this land so quickly? They had never been here, supposedly. I mean, you see what I'm saying? It's a lot of things. A lot of red flags with the slave ship narrative. And it's really, really horrible because they are lying to us. We never came over here on slave ships. They made those stories up. We are the original American Indians of this land. I'm going to be just like Dane Calloway. If you don't believe me, look it up. Look up your family history. There is a 90% chance you're going to find out you're Indian somewhere. They got us claiming to be African American because if you claim to be something else from another continent, you can't claim sovereignty in the Americas and get your land back, get your rights back, and things like that. We're not supposed to be American. We're not supposed to be U.S. citizens, any of those things. We are the true American Indians. The people that we call American Indians, those are Native Americans, which are descendants of the Mongols, who came over here way, way, way later. And they sat there and took them, and they have these schools on record, to Indian training schools and literally taught these Mongols, these Asian people, our culture, and taught them how to take over our culture and claim our rights and claim our lands and claim our identity. And so, it's a lot to process. When you process, you find out that you're not actually African. And you can tell we're not. We don't even look like Africans. And people say, well, what about these genetic tests? The DNA tests that link you to whatever tribe you came from. Africans came from us millennia ago. Africans are our descendants. Life did not start in Africa. Africa is not the motherland. If you research the oldest indigenous tribe on the face of the earth, it was decreed by the United Nations in 1993, is the Washita Indians of Louisiana, my father's tribe, just happens to be my father's tribe. They are the oldest indigenous people on earth, meaning they predate the Africans, they predate everybody. You can carbon date Africans. You can find out their origin. They have not been able to carbon date the Washita yet because our records go back so far. They can't carbon date us. That's why we're the oldest. So life started over here. So Africans are our descendants. They came from us. They're not, those DNA tests are not telling you that you came from them. It's telling you where your particular bloodline went when your particular bloodline left this continent and went to Africa millennia ago. Of course, we have similar genetic markers. That some of our genetic markers are the same as Africans. They're our descendants. They came from us, not the other way around. Everything, remember, everything is taught in reverse. So I just wanted to get on here and talk about us being Indian. If you're a fan of Dan Calloway or not, just watch Dan Calloway. Dan Calloway channel is on YouTube. Look him up. He's doing very good job waking people up. He woke me up. He's waking a lot of people up. But it's time that people know who and what we truly really are. We do not all have Indian in our family for no reason. We're not mixed with Indian. We are the Indians. We are not African American. Don't call yourself African American. You're not African. Don't call yourself black, because black is a curse. You are American Indian. You are indigenous. You're Aboriginal, and your culture is beautiful. And and it's crazy because our culture is still alive. It's just that the Native Americans have taken it. But we have to take our culture back and take our rights back away from them as well. And they need to wake up to who they are. It's people, nobody knows who they are. Everybody has to research. So if you know what tribe you are, put it in the comments. If you know who you are, put it in the comments. If you've been researching or have any questions, ask me in the comments. Any other red flags you notice about the slave trade narrative and the slavery narrative, please also put that in the comments. Also, side note, we were never slaves. We worked as indentured servants, and we worked as workers, and we worked under horrible conditions. Not saying that it's peaches and cream, because it wasn't, but we were never slaves. That is something we have to get away from. But we were farm workers, and we were farmers, and they had us farming because we knew the land, because we were from here. But yeah, let me know what you think in the comments, and I will talk to you all later. Bye bye.